Good morning and welcome to the first in a series of webinars hosted by New Zealand Wine. Ahead of World Sauvignon Blanc Day, which is this Friday, the 1st of May, we've decided to present the first of a range of webinars when we are going to get 3 of the world's leading wine experts, who also happen to be master sommeliers, to come and have a kind of roundtable discussion, which we hope will be interesting, and ask questions, discuss the state of the wine industry here in New Zealand. So first thing we should really say is that there are apparently nearly 500 people registered watching this around the world, and Chris Stroud has just counted up. There are 28 countries taking part today. So this is great news, but obviously if all 500 people ask questions at the same time, it might be chaotic. So you can ask questions. There's a question function as part of the webinar. We can't hear you, but the questions will pop up on the screen. So if you'd like to ask anything that comes to mind that way, then we'll ask it and direct them to the panel that we've got in front of us. If you have a problem with your tech, we have a chap called Madison who seems to be a genius at this thing. So if you just put a question to him on this your box, and he'll intercept them and help you out. So we can't see you, but we can definitely hear you via your questions. So who we got today? So we got Ronan back again. Hello, Ronan. So hello. We've got we're just introducing. So we've got Ronan Sayburn, master sommelier from London. We've got John Szabo, master sommelier from Canada, and I've got David Keck, master sommelier from the United States, and they'll be telling you a little bit more about themselves as we get into it. So we know now you can ask a question, and then after that it's a sort of roundtable discussion. So you could ask, why am I sitting here in New Zealand? Very good question, really. I entered the wine trade in 1985 and remember going to work in London and getting a delivery of Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc, and everybody standing around the bottle because it didn't have a label like anything else that I'd ever seen. All the other wines in the shop had Chateau or the producer on the front or something like that. And suddenly there was this amazing wine with a resting label on the front, really caught my attention. And so I don't even want to think how long ago that is now, much too long to remember, 30 some years, have loved the wines of New Zealand, managed to snare a very handsome New Zealander and persuaded him to come and relocate back to Auckland about 20 years ago now. So that's me. That's why I've got a slightly weird accent, but I'm sitting here in Auckland this morning. So I'm going to hand it over to Ronan, who's going to, I'm sure everyone knows the 3 esteemed gentlemen, but Ronan, if you could lead off, tell us something.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks, guys, John and David. Good to see you. Nice to see you, Jane. Yeah, thanks for joining. We thought that, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is such an important category, I would say, for New Zealand for definite, but I would say every decent wine list in the world has a bottle or a representation of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So really, we're going to talk about Sauvignon Blanc in general, more specifically about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, but really kind of, do people like it? Do people not like it? Do people find it too in your face, too extreme? Styles do people like, and really I think that's the discussion. Some of the wine trade, it tends to be a love or hate thing with Sauvignon Blanc. It's too grassy or too thiol like, so I guess it's just sort of like, where does it fit in the wine world? So and I remember my first bottle of Cloudy Bay when I was still a catering student in Scarborough, and there was a wine shop that used to get, I think, 6 bottles of Cloudy Bay a year, and I used to go in and on bended knee beg them to give me 2 bottles, and I used to always wait for my 2 bottles of Cloudy Bay to come. But yeah, and it was phenomenal. The label was iconic. The wine was absolutely like nothing I'd ever tried before. Yeah, it was awesome wine.
Yeah, no, we all have memories, and then it was joined by lots of other wineries bringing their wines in. So yeah, absolutely fun times. It was so youthful to remember. And John, what about you? And your take on Sauvignon Blanc?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. And if I could just say, if there's any silver lining in its global mess, it's this moment right here. I mean, when would we have, the 4 of us, been able to sit in a room together? We can sit virtually in a room from different parts of the planet. So this is pretty amazing, I have to say. So I've been to New Zealand a couple of times, and like everyone else here, I think on the panel, my first experience with New Zealand Sauvignon was Cloudy Bay. I remember, was it 1996 that it was #1 wine in the Wine Spectator, back when I used to read Wine Spectator magazine, but that really kind of launched the brand that New Zealand Sauvignon has become, and it really hasn't looked back since. I know there's a lot of discussion in the trade about the dangers of putting all your eggs in one basket, and that question has been asked of New Zealand, but I think now, that's a quarter of a century in, that by definition is an extremely long trend, not a short-lived little blip on the worldwide wine market scene. And if you ask me, I think it's around to stay. As Ronan mentioned, it's almost a necessity on a wine list anywhere around the world. It's one of those categories that as a wine list engineer you need to fill. The question is what style and what particular brand, but there's a niche in every wine list for this particular style of wine. So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Sorry, a lady called Anne has asked, she comes from Ontario, Ronan, she said, where in Scarborough? But I don't think you're Scarborough, Ontario, are you? You're Scarborough.
I'm not Scarborough, Ontario, no. I'm Scarborough, Yorkshire.
And David, how about you? Why have you come to join us? What excites you about New Zealand?
I'll reiterate John's sentiment. First of all, good morning to Jane and those in that part of the world, and afternoon to those of us in Eastern Standard Time, and good evening to the rest. And yeah, so my first experience was also Cloudy Bay, but I came a little bit later to the wine business, and I was backpacking and hanging out in New Zealand for fun in 2002, and some buddies were going bungee jumping, and I decided I'd go visit some wineries instead. And already being excited about wine, and just dropped into Cloudy Bay to see what they were doing. And 2002 was kind of actually a pretty iconic vintage and a leaping off point, I think, for New Zealand in many respects. It was a period of a lot of growth. So pretty exciting for me at that time to try the wines, which tasted very different than a lot of what I'd had. And I think that one of the exciting aspects about this seminar, for those that are listening, this is obviously kind of geared toward the wine industry and trade. I'd like to think, especially with these three esteemed colleagues and brilliant folks on the call with me, that we're going to try and dive a little bit deeper and expose some of, discuss some of the stereotypes, discuss some of the preconceived ideas about Sauvignon Blanc, and specifically New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. If you fall off at some point or things get technical, don't worry, we'll come back to the surface shortly. It's easy to go down the rabbit hole. But really excited to discuss what I think is a really misunderstood grape variety, for one that's planted so unbelievably widely across the planet. It expresses itself so in so many different diverse ways, and New Zealand is just one brilliant example. So it's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I would say that one of the reasons I love working here in New Zealand is that kind of New Zealand spirit. There's a sort of a obviously look back to kind of regions that have been more established, but it's that kind of ability which is very strong, I think, running through them, which is we're going to make it work, or we're going to do something, and we don't care if no one else has done it before, and so what, we're here, we're going to do it. So I think that's why, even though it's only maybe what the first vines go in the early 70s in somewhere like Marlborough, in a relatively short period of time, we've done pretty well. So if you could, do you mind each of you telling me how New Zealand wine, especially the Sauvignon, are perceived in your markets? Obviously, it's a newish category, but
what's that phrase that you use in New Zealand? It's the wire. What is it? The wire thing.
Number 8 wire.
Yeah, number 8 wire. Okay, so it means you can basically make everything out of anything. Yeah, it's a good phrase. To kind of go to attitude. Yeah.
Having burst onto the stage with all these vibrant wines, what do you think, say in England, in London, wherever you're there, what keeps people's attention? What is it about the wines that makes them so special?
Well, I think that as an educator, I think it's great. It's a great teaching tool, something like Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, because it has flavors that are so well defined. Things like the green, the grassy, asparagus, cucumber skin, pea shoot flavors, and then that tropical guava, passion fruit, all of those sort of things, plus the high acidity and the no oak. So when you when you're teaching about wine, especially people who are quite new to wine, it's a very easy wine to understand and to pick out flavors. And I think because of that, people love it. I mean, in the UK, the top selling grape variety for whites is definitely Sauvignon Blanc. I think the highest selling white wine in supermarkets by a long way is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I think around $7.50 compared to the next competitor, which is £5, £6, something like that. So it's definitely it's definitely New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc in the UK. It's definitely something that people like, definitely a thing that people love. And I think one of the main things for me with it is its consistency. Because people always know what they're going to get. They might have to pay a little bit more for it, but they know exactly what they're going to get. And it's going to be all about an explosion of fruit and vibrancy and freshness. And it really kind of represents that sort of clean green land that we envision New Zealand to be.
Right. But John, do you think that that's sometimes a bit of a disadvantage because people are expecting the certain style, which we know and love that Ronan's mentioned, but maybe don't realise that there are other regions with different styles emerging? Do you think we're telling that story?
Well, yeah, certainly an advantage and disadvantage, but again, it depends on who you're asking. And you know, not that all consumers are the same. We know that it's a really diverse and broad group of people who drink wine around the world, but unquestionably, the familiarity, the comfort of the familiarity, the regularity of let's call it Marlborough Sauvignon classic style is such that people gravitate towards it. It's just so easy, as Ronan said, to understand. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. It's a wine that you can grasp and recognize. You know, in the master sommelier circles, we all love New Zealand classic Sauvignon Blanc styles because it's the give away on the blind tasting lineup, right? It's just so easy to pick out. And I think it's quite remarkable that, you know, when the pioneers, you could go back to 1973 in Montana, but let's move it into the 90s, we weren't really chasing any other style. It's just a style that evolved naturally, given the climate, soil conditions in Marlborough in particular, and created the style of wine that was so distinctive and so unique and difficult to reproduce elsewhere. You can approximate, but I think you can all agree that Marlborough style in the classic Sauvignon is a pretty unique wine. And that is unquestionably a big advantage in the consumer market. Like in the UK, I'm sure in the US as well. It's the #1 selling wine, premium wine in Canada. Actually, one brand in Crawford is, I think, 300,000 cases a year, which is big for Canada. You know, we're 30 million, 35 million people. So it's a significant proportion of the market. And also another interesting little stat, and I was checking into it, as again, I think elsewhere in the world, it has the highest average bottle price. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, as a specific category across the country, has the highest average bottle price, which is at $17.75 in Canadian dollars, which not surprisingly corresponds to the average price of a New Zealand Sauvignon on most of the liquor board shelves around the world. So it's that comfortable niche, premium, but not too expensive, recognizable, comforting, familiar, and I think that's a big part of its success. We can talk about the sommelier community, where you know, it's easy to disparage something that's so successful, and that's the flip side of that coin, which is that anything that does so well is going to be, you know, looked down upon by certain people in the trade who like to be a little bit different. I guess I could say that. But that fair to say, David? Is that happening down in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't agree more, and I think it is that double-edged sword aspect that Ronan brought up of the clarity, and that you reiterated, right? The clarity of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, which to a large extent, I mean, Sauvignon Blanc is not a grape variety that expresses the same way in any given place, but Marlborough, just by sheer daylight hours, sunlight hours, right, is sunnier than almost any other growing region in the world. And so Sauvignon is going to express itself in a very specific way there. That is distinct from anywhere else in the world. And I think as a learning tool, right, to talk about all of the chemical compounds that we love throwing around in the sommelier community and the wine community, as far as pyrazines and thiols and all of this, like there couldn't be a better and more sort of transparent perspective on those. But then it is, again, on the other side, the easiest thing to disparage from a sophisticated palate perspective, where it's like, well, these things are so clear and so linear and specific, then there isn't as much to talk about here. And I think that's where it's easy to fall into gross generalizations that are not actually 100% correct, and I think are becoming less and less valid as the category develops, right? But from a sales perspective, there is a great joy in the ability to put a wine on the list that our guests and customers can pretty much understand on the most basic level what they're going to get, what is going to come out of the glass at them. As far as flavor profiles, there is diversity, and we're going to dive into that, I think, in a moment. But the ability to pour something where they're not going to be shocked, surprised, or irritated about what they're tasting, there's great comfort in that. And I think that it's easy as sommeliers to err on the side of shooting for something that is more interesting, quote unquote, and not appreciate the sort of banker that we've got in New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc.
Well, I mean, for me, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and Argentine Malbec have been the two massive successes in the New World, you know, that are proving really popular with customers, you know. And if they're not kind of connoisseurs, or they're not, you know, they just like a nice glass of wine. Argentinian Malbec and New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, I think, are both fantastic. But going beyond that, there's a lot more artisan producers producing a lot more serious stuff than the kind of the explosion in the glass kind of fruit flavors. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting category of wine. But you know, talking about bottom line in a restaurant, you know, that's the stuff that's gonna sell with your customers and make your customers come back.
I'm just going to nip in for a second because someone has asked a question, will this be being recorded? And yes, it is. So afterwards, the transcript of this for those who either have can't get online or whatever. So yes, it will be recorded and available post thing. But one chap here, James, has said, are we still allowed to like gooseberries? Is it like purchasing a diamond ring and only focusing and the setting? So what?
How many people have actually had a gooseberry? I wonder. I have to throw that question out there because it's not a common thing that we see in the supermarkets, but we still have to throw it out as a descriptive term.
And
yeah, can you love it?
Hairy, like that needs a shave. It normally has little prickles on it, so you normally have to cook it and kind of temper its, shall we say, surprising acidity level by. In England, we custard or cream or something like that to make it. But it's a very piercing, haunting kind of character.
I very rarely hear the term gooseberry anymore now because, you know, wine world's become so international that it's, you know, if you ask people, I think maybe in Australia or New Zealand what a gooseberry was, I don't know if you'd have them. Canada, do you have gooseberries?
We have no gooseberries here.
Yeah.
No boxwood, no gooseberries. We do have asparagus, we do have jalapeno. But I thought this whole seminar is getting past the gooseberries. Can we talk about some of the other styles being produced across this diverse country?
The first time I went to America, I wanted to taste a Meyer lemon to see if a Meyer lemon was different from a normal lemon, and it's not.
We've got lots of gooseberry lovers online, so people from Ontario and Ireland are saying no, they've had gooseberries. So that's a positive one. So yeah, sometimes I find when we go and teach in Asia, then they don't have, you know, we had a hilarious moment. We tried to show them what rhubarb was, and they thought it was I was playing a joke on them. I'm like, no, it looks unusual to be having a sort of 7-foot stalk with some sort of hairy leaf. English people love it, but they all thought that was so maybe it's a very Anglo-Saxon we're using, but whatever. No, so David, do you think people, you know, obviously there's some gooseberry lovers online, but would you say that is when you are working and advising and speaking to people in the US, do they tend to favor one of the methoxypyrazine styles, you know, the greener, grassier kaffir lime, or the thiol ones, or is it an open pitch, or what happens?
You know, I think in my experience, I think it really is leaning to that thiol character that I think comes out just due to the sunlight hours in New Zealand. I think that bright tropical fruit character is what has most of the allure, because I think that when you find parallels at the similar, I would say a similar price point when you're looking at, say, French Sauvignon from the Loire Valley, or even a less expensive option from Bordeaux, if it's leaning more into the pyrazine side, into those, you know, green asparagus. I say jalapeno, that evidently isn't quite as international as I'd hoped. You know, I think that those characters are less appealing to the average American sitting at the table who's looking for I would argue, the more tropical side of Sauvignon Blanc, which really is there in spades in something like a classic New Zealand Marlborough
Right.
Sauvignon. And so for those listening, we kind of picked some selections, by the way, of like classic, and then some bottles that are a little bit more, you know, maybe single vineyards or oaked or what have you. I've got Zephyr right now as a super classic example of Sauvignon Blanc. Just, you know, stainless steel, no oak, no, yeah, a little, just
One of the questions that's come in is, what does the profile of a really excellent Sauvignon Blanc look like to you? So the three of you mind saying, if you were tasting a glass of wine and you thought, this is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, what is it that lifts it above, you know, makes it the special one?
Well, I mean, for me, it's a combination of all those things, nothing in excess. So it's all about balance, but lots of flavors, lots of layers of complexity, but nothing in excess. So not too tropical, not too oaked, not too grassy, not too green, but a little bit of everything. I think that's you know, and I love oaked Sauvignon as well, but I love Bordeaux styles. I love the oak styles from Marlborough, but yeah, I'd say everything just in balance.
Okay.
All right, I would agree with that. The one that I've chosen as one of my classic is from Mansfield, one of the older wine, actually the first winery in Marlborough, 1873, if you can believe it, they were founded. And they're a little bit different. I mean, I agree in the sense that sometimes you can have a little too much of a good thing if it's too gooseberry, too tropical, and you lose any nuance, whereas a wine like Mansfield and many others in this style are a little bit more toned down, you could say, better balance, and not just, you know, a single straight line of grapefruit or gooseberry or asparagus or jalapeno, however you want to call it. So, I mean, it has to have the balance. Hallmarks, of course, would be higher acidity, and I do prefer them dry. Some of the more commercial examples, as we've all tried, have a little bit of residual sugar, and that's a simple fact. When you have super high yields and you stretch it, the acids can be pretty fierce, and you know, 5-6 grams of residual sugar can help to tame that, and that's the real commercial end of the spectrum, and that's fine. But for me, I would go for something that's you know, slightly lower yielding, a little bit more textural. For me, texture is a big part of wine in general, and certainly white wines. I tend to angle more towards wines that have more interesting layers of textural elements as opposed to just straight up aromatics.
Right.
Yeah.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything, obviously, that Ronan and John said. As far as structural elements, I prefer, you know, obviously, I really think that a dry wine is the way to go there, and I'd agree with John a lot of. There are definitely some examples with a little sweetness to them, and so I kind of steer away from those. I'm okay with a pretty exaggerated acidity, and that just for my own palate, and I think it's also pretty classic. There's some examples sort of hitting the market right now that have a slightly more muted aspect there, trying to sort of soften that. But I think Marlborough Sauvignon for me, or I should say New Zealand Sauvignon, because we're gonna certainly delve into some of the other regions, has that exaggerated acidity, and then balancing the tropical aspects with the herbaceous character, and really finding something that has that dramatic aromatic intensity, which I think is classic, but not leaning too heavily to one side or the other, as Ronan said, for sure. And then
I think we're all wine people, and we've all done wine exams, and you know, when you're in that mindset, it's great to pick up a glass and say, oh yeah, I know where that comes from. I know what that is. So varietal, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, one person has asked, guys, can we see your bottles? So I think possibly afterwards we'll all take photos of the ones that we've chosen, and hopefully New Zealand Wine can collate something so you'll see what we've chosen, because we were asked to choose a classic style, if you like, just discuss the word classic, and then something that showed specifically where it came from, and then a wine that was something slightly out there. So we'll see those as we went along. I chose a wine, the Tafare Ra wine from Marlborough, because I think that especially at the moment here in New Zealand, we're extraordinarily focused on looking after, you know, we've seen these ghastly pictures and reports of the world destroying itself. So I like the idea that they are both organic and biodynamic, and Anna, who is the winemaker, is a sort of wine woman force field for looking after the soil. And I think that's what we're going to see points of difference. It's not just about winemaking, or it's not just about where the wines come from, but it's the people that are taking care of, custodians of what they're looking after. I think this is a strong movement. I mean, it's still a small movement, but I think it's a vocal, opinion forming. So I don't know.
That's very much part of New Zealand mentality, though, isn't it? That sustainability and that, close to nature and all that sort of thing. I mean, in New Zealand, it's considered to be absolutely the normal, whereas other people bang the drum about that sort of thing as if they're special. In New Zealand, everyone's just like that. Everyone has tremendous respect for the vineyards and the land.
Yep, no. Sorry, there's one here which we could spend at least a day arguing this. Which is from from New Zealand, which says, why do even the top Sauvignon Blanc, including worldwide Sauvignons, rarely achieve over 91 or 92 points in ratings? What does it have to achieve 100 points? What does the missing 10 points represent? Well, we could have an argument about whether scoring is useful or not, to be honest with you, but
yeah, that's a philosophical discussion that's going to drag us way off topic, I fear.
If we're looking what you're looking for, then you're all saying they're all positive. So why is it a cultural cringe? Do people still not think, compared to something like Riesling, that Sauvignon is a noble grape variety?
Oh, I think that would be a very difficult argument to make. I think there are brilliant examples of Sauvignon Blanc in so many different areas that, if you want to argue that some of the top Sauvignon Blancs from New Zealand to, we talked about Dagenham, you want to talk about some of the great classified Bordeaux Blanc, it just doesn't make any sense. I think Sauvignon Blanc as a grape variety is one of the noble varieties, and I think that is, it would be very difficult to argue that it's not. I think as far as the point system, I don't think it's worth delving into, simply because, and not to diminish the question, I think the question's a valid one. I don't know that the point system's a valid one, and I think it's actually disappearing as far as its relevancy. So I don't know.
Okay.
For me, in the world, there's like 6 places that make great Sauvignon. There'd be Bordeaux, the Loire, Chile, Styria in southern Austria, Friuli in northern Italy, and then New Zealand. And I think that the interesting thing about Sauvignon is it can come at all price levels. So it can come as a cheap and cheerful supermarket wine, or it can come as your Domaine de Fiesole or Chateauneuf Pape Clément Blanc, something like that. So I think it can get up there for people that are interested in scores as a very high scoring wine. Your argument might be maybe in Bordeaux Blanc it's part of a blend, so it's blended with Semillon. But then again, so is Cabernet Sauvignon blended with Merlot and Petit Verdot. So,
yeah, it might be interesting to actually segue off of that question into, I know we've all sort of selected some single vineyard locations and to discuss some regionality, because I think that is one conversation, is looking at what Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand will be in the future. And that we've all got the classic example of Sauvignon Blanc, but also I think when we get into some I hate to say more serious, but I guess some bottlings where people are really trying to show site specificity and not just a sort of quaffable bottle, then I think we get into some really interesting discussion. So would this be an opportune time to delve into a little more regionality?
Do you think people overseas understand? Do you think, coming from a country where often there's a map of Australia and then New Zealand kind of disappears, you have to kind of find it, do you think that people are really ready to explore different regions of New Zealand? Do you think they just, because Marlborough dominates just by sheer plantings, do you think that if they know where New Zealand is, then they know where Marlborough is? Do you think they're ready for the next step?
Well, that's a big question. Do they know where Marlborough is? Well, we're all just guilty of it at some point so far in this seminar, talking about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I think we need to be a lot more specific, kind of like the discussions around, say, Australian Shiraz. You can't really say Australian Shiraz anymore. You really have to get into sub-regional specificities, because it's not all the same. It's not one monolithic style, although Marlborough, and within Marlborough, one classic style does dominate the market commercially in volume. There are so many other different little areas within Marlborough, and then in other parts of the country, like this first wine that I was talking about, Arnsfield, actually comes from the southern valleys. So I don't know, Jane, if you can throw up a map. Do we have a map of Marlborough that we could share with the crowd?
Can everyone see that, or do I have to press something?
Can't see it. Sorry.
Oh.
It's 8:30 in the UK, so that's why I'm thinking my line.
No, it's gone.
No, sorry.
There we go. So when I was down for New Zealand Pinot Conference in 2013, there was a lot of discussion about obviously Pinot Noir, but Pinot Noir in Marlborough specifically, the differences you'd see from the gravelly plains of the Wairau Valley versus the southern valleys. I think they should call it the Southern Hills. It sounds better than Southern Valleys, but this is an area to the south of Blenheim, and up literally in the hills where the soil type is completely different and the weather is a little bit different, a little bit drier, and the style of Pinot and obviously Sauvignon is reflected in that slightly different geographical location. For me, with Sauvignon Blanc, like the Ansfield here, a little bit broader, a little bit richer, back to my love of textural wines. That's why I kind of gravitated to this particular area and this particular style. And yields naturally tend to be a little bit lower. I guess it's interesting to note that, you know, in certain parts of Marlborough, you can get 15 plus tons per hectare. Hopefully you can make the conversion if you're in acres or if you want some other metric, but that's a lot of wine. Compared to, say, Southern Valleys, where you're down at least probably 20–30%, and then you move up into the North Island to an area like Martinborough, where if you get half that, it's already considered a banner vintage. But the drop in yields tends to result in slightly riper grapes, a little bit less pyrazine, so less of that really pungent grassy side. And then, according to your winemaking techniques, you can drop the level of thiols. You get a little bit less of that pungent grapefruit, guava, passion fruit character, and end up with something a little bit more balanced, a little bit richer and textural. So even within Marlborough, you know, there are quite significant differences without even going across into the Watry Valley next door, so over the Kaikoura Range, not far, but different enough, much windier, and there you get a far more pungent pyrazine type character because it's cooler, because it's so much windier. So it's fun to play around with Sauvignon even within Marlborough, not even talking about the other regions that grow it.
Well, one of the questions is, I really love the wines from Martinborough, and I know that David, you've chosen Martinborough, another region. So do you want to talk to why that excites you, or what is about Martinborough that you think separates it from Marlborough? Because there's lots of questions on regionality. I feel we've got lots of students and bits and pieces. They want to know kind of the different regions of New Zealand. So why have you chosen Martinborough?
Yeah, and I think that just to sort of respond to your first query as far as are people ready for that, I don't know that half of our consumers really know the difference between, you know, in America, Napa and Sonoma, or fill in the blank. I think that I think we need to know, right? And I think the question is always, do consumers care what they see? And I think from a retail perspective, maybe, but really it has more to do with the sommeliers and the wine buyers, and for retail and for what other outlet, it has to do with them understanding, so that they're able to, so that we, I guess, are able to put in front of our guests examples that we think are expressive of those places, right? So the first one I had was the Zephyr, which is from Dillon's Point in Marlborough, which is great, and a little closer to the coast, and has a beautiful salinity to it, and really cool ocean influence there. Marlborough, for me, I just get, and I went with Craggy Range's Timuna, which should be pretty available. I think it's fun to kind of bounce between Zephyr, which is tiny. Ben Glover's production is small, and he's an amazing human being and friend. And then, you know, Craggy Range, a little bit larger company that has a distribution a little bit more widely. This is a single vineyard from Timuna, Timuna Road. And I think here it's actually it's a little richer, it's a little more concentrated. They're not afraid to use a little bit of oak. There's some foeder on this, and some used oak, and I think 3% new oak on it as well. And so that obviously influences that, and in a way that doesn't necessarily have to do with the climate itself. But for me, I love that sort of richness and a little bit more stone fruit that I get from Martinborough, and that may be just me. Martinborough is not that far from Marlborough, but it is absolutely not in the Sounds, and it's a very, very different place. So.
And Ronan, what did you go for? What was your?
So my second one, I went for Mahi. I went for the Boundary Farm from Mahi, which is very site specific. You know, small production. You know, Brian Bicknell there is doing an amazing job. It's a lot more of a textural style of Sauvignon for me, so it's less on the grassiness or the tropical style. So it's a lot more kind of what I was saying earlier, my style, which is more about kind of balance, more site specific. Yeah, so I think that's yeah, that's a great wine from a very small plot in Marlborough.
Okay, and I chose
my second pick, although I was talking about the other wine, Single Vineyard, and this is not so much about the site, but more about style. Dog Point, anyone who's ever tasted this knows that as much as Sauvignon from New Zealand stands out in an international tasting, Dog Point stands out from the rest of the Sauvignons from New Zealand in any tasting. It's a very, very reductive style, and most wines are in Marlborough made reductively, but by that I mean it develops a lot of that sulfide, flinty, smoky character, and is almost absent, at least when you freshly open it, any of the pungency of the green or the thiol side. And the history of this wine is pretty much tied to the history of all of Marlborough. Ivan Sutherland and James Healy, they started Dog Point not until 2004, I think. 2002 was their first vintage they launched, but they both worked with Cloudy Bay, along with Kevin Judd from Grey Wacky. I think we're going to taste one of his wines in a moment. So these three gentlemen kind of pioneered the style that all brought us to New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, yet when they moved out and started their own project, they moved quite a distance away stylistically, even though a lot of the fruit from the vineyard still goes to Cloudy Bay, as I understand, and the plantings are right next to the original plantings of Montana's back in 1973. So we're at the epicenter of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. The style they've chosen to go for, I like personally, but it's a much more, I think, polarizing style. The yields here are about half the average you get in Marlborough, so 7.5, 8 tons. So obviously more intensity right off the top, and then less of the obvious character and more of this, some people call it mineral, but it's really just sulfide character that you get through certain winemaking interventions or lack of interventions, as it is. So anyhow, it's a pretty interesting wine, and I think it's terrific.
I'm trying to man up myself because obviously for us here in New Zealand it's only 7:30 in the morning, and I feel as much of one I should be able to approach them at 7:30, but I chose Greystone because I'm always excited by the wines from North Canterbury, and I think again this is a barrel influence. It's probably not quite as out there as some of them, the heavily barrel influenced style, but again they're a biodynamic grower, extraordinary attention to detail, maybe a little bit not quite so punchy on the aromatics, but a beautiful wine, and shows that different regions. Obviously we've come down from Marlborough, we've gone down the coast through Kokura where the earthquake was, and then we're going in before we would reach Christchurch. For those of you out there who are saying, can you put the maps back up? Quite honestly, no, I can't. I know that if I was a better, more tech savvy person, I could finger over the keyboard, but I don't seem to be able to. Very, very quickly, and this is just a one-line answer. David, that's a rather large glass, says somebody. I see the others are using different glasses, but yours seems to be burgundy. Is there a preference, and if so, why?
Personally,
I don't know people watching, but apparently you've got a burgundy glass. Is this a choice?
I do have a burgundy glass. The reason for that actually has mostly to do with the fact I just moved to northern Vermont, and I only brought a few stems with me. So that's what I've got to work with, right?
Not a technical reason at all.
Yeah. I culled my glass collection down for the move. So anyway.
Marie Kondo.
He was going to use an end cup, but he managed to find a glass last minute.
The question, because one of my personal bugbears is when people talk about suddenly adding maybe barrel work or sort of manipulating the wine to be a sort of more complex as being better, when I think that they're just different styles. I don't see that these barrel influenced wines are any necessarily better than the really brilliantly made, clean, pristine classic ones. But one question which I think is interesting is said, is there a worry that if we do lots of things to these wines, use oak, MLF, lees aging, whatever, they will become the dominant feature and will take away the identity of what Sauvignon Blanc means to people? So a philosophical idea, what do you think?
I think my last wine answers all of that. So what is it? Where are we?
I can't see.
The Grey Wacky?
That's the Grey Wacky.
Wild
The wild. And that
Right.
wine is 100% malolactic. It's what, 6 or 8 months in new oak. I think it goes through a very slow 6-month fermentation. So it goes through, you know, lots of things that maybe classic Marlborough Sauvignon doesn't go through. And I think it's, you know, absolutely delicious. And I think it's very Sauvignon in character.
Right. So it's not
I
masking what
think
the.
the answer to your question, it doesn't take anything away.
Yeah, and I think that that's a loaded question simply because, I mean, why do people use, I would turn the question back around. Why do people use oak to begin with, right? You're not going to use oak on a wine that, well, hopefully you're not going to use oak on a wine that doesn't have the concentration to stand up to it and that will benefit from the application of oak. I've got, actually, my last bottle is Giesen's the August 1888, and you can see the vintage there. Well, it's backward, I think. I don't know technology. It's 2014, which I think is current release for that. It might be. They may have moved up from there, but 6 years old, and it shows a lot of beautiful complexity. The oak is not a lot of new oak, and it's pretty well integrated. And so I think the question is really not, are people using it to cover up or masquerade as something that it's not? I think it's saying, are the grapes that we're harvesting right now ones that will benefit from the use of oak, and is it going to make a wine that is actually something different in a positive way? Not, can I make this something it's not?
Okay.
I think it'd be a disservice to the variety to render it in only one singular style, right? I mean, the grape is clearly capable of producing a pretty broad range of wines. You know, just on the 6 or so regions that Ronan mentioned, those are all very distinct and different wines, but they're all Sauvignon or Sauvignon based at least. And any of us, I think, in the trade celebrate diversity. And why not celebrate diversity in Sauvignon Blanc with a number of techniques when properly applied, still speak to some sort of regionality and some varietal character, but yet put the grape or put the producer's wine into their own personal spin on it. I think that's absolutely valid, and I hope it continues, quite frankly.
And it is such a dominant varietal characteristic for the wine. It's going to take a lot to knock that out of the Sauvignon Blanc, I think. So.
Sure.
True.
Well, I did find a wine that kind of did that. This my third wine is a bit of a flyer. It's called Supernatural. I hadn't tasted this until about 3 minutes before we began. I actually had to get my corkscrew out for this bottle, not because I had to pull a cork out of it, but it was closed by crown cap. So already a little bit different there. But the Supernatural company, they're up in Hawke's Bay, so we could talk a little bit about the regional difference right off the bat. I mean, Hawke's Bay is considerably warmer than Marlborough or Martinborough. It's not for nothing that's where the best red wines in New Zealand are made. More on that, I think, in a later session. You can ripen Syrah and the Cabernet up there. And Sauvignon takes on a different profile yet again. Obviously riper, richer, broader, a little bit more alcohol. And then you take, I guess you can call it a technique so old it's new again, more natural approach with some skin contact. This gets about 6 or so hours, I think, on the skins, and then bottled with minimal sulfur. 2018, I don't know how well you can see the color here, but it's already considerably deeper. This is what I would expect from a 10 or 12-year-old, more classic style Marlborough. So it's much more evolved in character. And with oxygen, you degrade the thiol component in any wine. It's it goes down pretty dramatically after either exposure in barrel or through time in bottle, or in this case with low sulfur, nothing there to protect it or very little, you drop out that character. So, I would be much more hard pressed to pick this out in the lineup of wines from around the world as New Zealand Sauvignon. It has its own very distinctive profile. Love it or hate it. It's not a style that I drink a lot of, but it's another valid interpretation. And I tell you what, there are wine bars all around the world that would be more than delighted to pour this style of wine. It's New Zealand Sauvignon, so it checks that box, but then it's a completely idiosyncratic style that will gain some fans and probably a few detractors along the way.
Absolutely.
I chose a Hawke's Bay wine as well. So I chose the Tomato, the Cape Crest. So this does have a little bit of Sauvignon Gris and Semillon in it, and I just absolutely adore that wine because I think it's a wine that it is under cork or DM. So like you, I had to go chasing around to try and find the wretched what do you call those things? We don't use them in New Zealand, the corkscrew. But I finally found one, and as I say, the attention to detail was great. But one thought is often when I look at wines like that, I think, well, you know, there's such good value for money, all this extra effort and richness and wines built to last. Do you think that in New Zealand, do we need to be asking more money for these top end wines? How do you drive the market, the premiumization up? Do we come out with a $250 bottle of Sauvignon and then hope that, what do you think?
Well, probably not. I mean, you'd be hard to find a $250 bottle of Bordeaux, you know.
Right.
But I mean, I don't think that's. I think it's a very, for me personally, I think it's a very stupid consumer that buys wines that are expensive and thinks that they're great. So unless it's done in tiny, tiny amounts and there's something really special about to justify that price tag is not the most important thing. You know, I think there's a premium that you would pay for a very good bottle of a Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, but I don't think it would be £250. I think it would be, you know, maybe the top end wines, you know, £50–60.
But why when other countries around the world charge simply ridiculous prices for wines with no pedigree because they feel that they can, you know, create a stir with them? And then do you think in New Zealand we're kind of don't want to be seen to pop our head above the tall poppy?
Let me turn that question around to you, Jane, a little bit. Being a transplanted Brit now living in New Zealand, it seems pretty, speaking of terroir, it seems pretty contradictory to the New Zealand personality to even ask for that much money for a bottle of wine. That said, and I'd be curious whether you agree or disagree, but I think it's a very humble group of folks when I was there who have trouble asking for money for the wine, period.
Right.
But I was thinking, sorry.
I'm gonna.
I just think that, like, I think the developing pedigree behind a wine and developing what people would call an iconic version of a thing actually does, to some extent, on occasion, help a region. If there is that one sought after label that suddenly says, oh, this region's very serious and this is why, even if the wine doesn't necessarily warrant that, I think it's marketing. I'd be curious what you guys think.
I agree, David. Sadly, I agree. You know, there is a bit of a halo effect that is created by that ultra premium wine in whatever region. We in the trade, of course, don't want to see that because we always are searching for value. But the simple reality is that, yes, if there's one wine that fetches $200 a bottle, then selling one for 50 becomes much more feasible. And that was the question that I was toying around with before we started here. How does New Zealand move out of that price category? In Canada, everything is $18.95, it seems, across the country for the standard New Zealand Sauvignon. Can you ask for $30 or $35 a bottle? And the answer is currently with difficulty. I mean, as soon as you move into that category, it becomes much more challenging to sell that bottle of wine. And if you need to do that, and let's not forget, New Zealand's a pretty civilized country, the minimum wage there is quite high. I heard it's just gone up again. Is it what, $21, 22 New Zealand dollars per hour? Is that right, Jane?
Oh, I don't think it's as much.
I think you get minimum wage. I'm sure you're in a different category, but you know, that's $18, $19 in Canada. So that's a decent wage, and that drives up the cost of production. Land isn't quite as expensive as Burgundy, but it's going up as well. So you know, there's a reality there. You can't make really an expensive wine in New Zealand. It's simply not possible.
Well, and I was talking with Nigel Greening just yesterday. You know, Nigel's philosophy on, you know, his pricing of wine is great. It's very refreshing. You know, he says he obviously makes some of the best Pinots in New Zealand, some of the best Pinots in the world. Him and Blair do an amazing job with it. But, you know, he says that he's very disappointed. He knows that he can't drink Burgundy anymore because the price is so restrictive, and he produces wine that he wants people to drink. So he spreads it around to different markets so that people can't hoard it and then charge a lot for it and then have a monopoly on selling it at whatever they want. So he makes sure it gets spread all around the world, and he basically knows how much it costs him, and he wants people to drink it. And I think if you've got you know, an industry leader like Nigel doing that in New Zealand, I think he'll very much set the trend, because no one's going to come along and say, well, how much is Felton Road Pinot Noir or Chardonnay? Well, I'm going to charge more than that, because he won't have credibility, because Felton Road's one of the leaders. So
yeah.
I think that's a good philosophy for New Zealand to have. You know, maybe cover your ears, David. Maybe if you looked at somewhere like Napa Valley, which has gone a bit the other way, you know, wanting to charge super premium prices for things because it's done in small quantities and they know people will buy it because it's very rare and it's very expensive, so it must be the best.
I'll have a think about that one for a minute. While somebody has asked, do you think, I know I didn't really want to bring this up, but hey, there's questions about it. Perhaps the COVID-19 outbreak may bring new respect to New Zealand. Well, I think we were pretty respected anyway. Clearly, New Zealand knows how to do things the right way. So do you think that this will, do you think people look around the world and think, who coped well, you know, they're clean and green, they're brilliant people. When we're going to start drinking wine again, let's go to New Zealand.
Absolutely. I mean, around, you know, the shooting that happened not long ago, I mean, that was, you know, your Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, you know, the next day she said, right, we're banning automatic weapons tomorrow. And, you know, every other country would take, okay, well, in 3 years, we're going to ban it. But, you know, so I think, yeah, being a small country, being very reactive, I think was, yeah, it's a great asset towards you.
Yeah, I agree. I have to say, I think New Zealand will be seen in, well, it's already seen in quite a good light, and there is this impression that it's clean and green, and there are lots of sheep. I think 7 for every 1 person on the island. So it has this reputation of clean and green, and the sustainability is another aspect that New Zealand producers push quite hard. I mean, every wine we're tasting here is sustainably grown and certified as such, and lots of organics, and now more and more biodynamics. These are all things that are value adds, as they say in the marketing world, for consumers. And the reaction to COVID, I think, will also play off. Maybe not a huge factor, but will certainly play in the back of some people's minds. And why not? You know, I think we need to redefine our view of what fine wine is. I don't know if you caught Jane Skilton from Decanter wrote an interesting article about redefining fine wine in terms of sustainability and impact on the planet. New Zealand is already at the forefront of limiting impact, and I think more and more consumers are demanding that the products they buy are produced in a responsible way, socially, economically, and environmentally. So these are all things that I think will help move New Zealand out of the category that they seem to be locked into, sub $20, and then enable them to charge more moving forward.
Good. Yeah. No, that's excellent. There are lots of questions on regionality. So you've all been here and made visits to New Zealand. So if you, I mean, obviously Marlborough dominates in terms of plantings, but if you saw, for example, Essential Otago Sauvignon on the list, or Nelson, or Gisborne, what would you think? Do you think people will look for those, or your impressions, or do you think that we're still sticking to the biggies, as it were? Regionality, do you think? I know we're kind of circling back, but loads of people are asking about it. So what do you think?
I'm curious what I think it's important to understand whether the question is asked are the regions so identifiable and distinct from each other, or are people interested in wines from different regions, or like what is the goal with understanding regionality? I think from a sommelier and a wine buyer perspective, and honestly just a wine professional perspective, it's important to understand regionality in New Zealand as far as each of those climates and the way that grapes are grown and who's making those wines in those different places. But I think that how we speak about those with guests is really about the wine itself more than I think some sort of regional identifiers. I don't think our guests care that much at this point about those. I think it's about site specificity and producer, and that's on us to find, hey, this is a Central Otago producer. I realize that you're not used to drinking Sauvignon Blanc from Central Otago, at which point the guest says, I don't know what you're talking about, and you say, let me tell you about this wine that's really delicious.
Yeah, and I think as our job as sommeliers, it's to kind of like you know, encourage people's interest. And if someone has been to a supermarket and bought an Oyster Bay or a Montana and they love the style, and they come into a restaurant and you say to them as part of your job, you know, what do you like? And they say, I like these wines. You can say, well, what do you like about them? You can take them, you know, to different areas within New Zealand or different sub-regions within Marlborough. And I think that, you know, maybe the sommelier's job or the good retailer, the face-to-face selling is telling that next page of the story about Marlborough, about New Zealand Sauvignon. So, you know, the regionality, the regional differences, and the sub-regional regional differences in Marlborough.
Right. And what do you think if you, in each of your respective markets, and obviously it's a big question, but what do you see as may erode the market share for New Zealand Sauvignon? What are the people who are looking to encroach on its position? What wines are, you know, thinking, we could have a bit of that?
Well, I can answer from the Canadian perspective, and it's a little bit back to the danger of one singular style and also the economic reality of producing wine in New Zealand. But as already mentioned, Chile, as an example, is certainly capable of producing a similar style, not identical, but a similar style of wine for a lot less money. So what might cost you $18 from New Zealand will cost you 14 or 13 perhaps from Chile. And I'm sure the Chileans are looking at this as a great opportunity to Sauvignon is hot. The market has been open for us. We can produce it pretty good for a little bit less money. We can capture a lot of that market share. So this is where I think the New Zealand industry needs to be particularly vigilant in maintaining and making sure that it is worth that extra $5 or $6 or $7 a bottle by ensuring that the quality is on par with the price.
Yeah, and also I'd say Tasmania. I think there's a lot of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc goes to Australia. They drink a lot of it. And now Tasmania is really a very exciting region, cool climate, making some great sparkling wines, making great Pinots, great Chardonnays, and really great Sauvignons. And if the Aussies start moving to drinking Tasmanian Sauvignon rather than Marlborough Sauvignon, I think that could definitely be an issue.
Okay.
And I think actually sommeliers pose a risk to New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, in the sense that, I mean, if there are enough, you know, sommeliers who are so bound and determined to pour something new for their guest that they're picking a, you know, skin contact, you know, fill in the Sauvignon Gris from Timbuktu because they think that's more interesting than a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, which actually is what the guest wants to drink, then they start disappearing off lists because of the ego of sommeliers, and that can be a challenge, I think, actually. And so it's reminding, I think, our colleagues and ourselves on occasion that sometimes the guest knows what they want, and the thing they want it may have started with, you know, the grocery store, whatever least expensive Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand that they found, and now I can pour them Ben's wine and from Zephyr and talk about it, and it's not much more expensive than what they have already purchased and know they like.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of get over that feeling and just say we have to kind of be mindful of the consumer rather than just make it all about us and say we like something weird from somewhere weird, but hey, you know, this is really
I remember working many years for Gordon Ramsay. One of his things he had on all of his menus was like a good scallop dish and a good lamb dish, because he said everything on the menu is not going to be chefy and complicated and over the top, because some people want to come to the restaurant who just want to have some fairly simple food, nice ingredients and well cooked. And it's kind of like that. I've always had that philosophy writing a wine list. And I don't write wine lists for myself. I always write a wine list for my customers. And, you know, you have to perceive what your customers are going to drink. And some of it might not always be Romani Conti or Petrus. Some people will want to drink, you know, good quality, not expensive, red and white wine from all over the world.
And if Gordon Ramsay can make that statement, then I think any sommelier, no matter how sniffy, as you say there in the UK, should be able to do the same and say, all right, let's give the people what they want. It's going to keep me in business because it keeps my employer in business or my business in business. So, you know, I don't understand this idea of people going around shooting themselves in the foot, not listing despite themselves, despite the potential success that it could bring to a list. And let's face it, not everyone wants to drink weird and unusual wines. You know, you want something recognizable, familiar, happy, give it to the people that can drink it.
I think that goes back to your point, John, that there are so many different, we talk about the consumer or the wine drinker. Well, obviously there's millions of different segments of people interested in all sorts of different things. Just to lump one wine into one box like Australian Shiraz or Bordeaux or something is probably not very helpful. And it's a myriad of choices out there. And I think we'll be able to, personally here in New Zealand, I think that there's lots of opportunities for us to meet that demand. A couple of questions down the side, and we're approaching the bewitching hour. So one sentence, and then the people who've asked questions that we can't really get around to today, we'll try and answer some of those today. There's sort of different flavor profiles and bits and pieces. But someone said, well, when the three gentlemen are drinking Sauvignon, single sentence, what do you eat?
Asparagus.
Asparagus. Ooh.
Fresh green salad, clean, light vinaigrette, lemon vinaigrette. Pretty. Raw veggies.
Very healthy, aren't you?
I mean,
you know, where if you put one of those when you drink a wine, when you decide to have dinner tonight, what would you think? This is the perfect match for New Zealand Sauvignon.
Well, I think again the one question is which one?
Yeah, no, that's
August. I've got this 2014 oak Sauvignon. I'm gonna probably do like, you know, I'm gonna keep it simple, but roast a chicken, and I mean, be gorgeous.
And something I've done quite often is just like a grilled fillet fish with like a salsa verde over the top. So lots of fresh green herbs, some capers, some olive oil, grill the fish, and then put the salsa verde over the top. That's lovely.
It's almost aperitif hour, at least here in Canada. So I'm going to grab my classic Sauvignon and probably have a glass of that before dinner. And other than that, you know, you don't need to overthink this too much. Food and wine pairing, you could spend all day or 5 seconds on it. Tell me what it wouldn't match with. I mean, what would a classic Sauvignon be a train wreck with? Probably almost nothing. You know, you can have your plate of charcuterie, you can have a roast chicken, you can have your fish, you can have your ceviche, you can have your asparagus salad. It's a pretty versatile wine at the end of the day. So much the better.
Well, I shall take your advice, because I'm going to go, and my daughter's trying to get us on a health kick. So she's made what looks like a dustbin full of bircher muesli. So I'm not sure I can necessarily have breakfast with a glass, but I'll do my best. I'll see if I can man up and be an expert. So I have to point out that I can't thank you, John, Ronan, and David enough, because you're not off the hook yet. In another, I think it's month's time, there's another one of these, which I think is Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and then there's I think after that. Oh, there's all sorts of fun things happening. So for those of you who've been so sweet and have registered for today, then there's the details coming out for you to register for another one. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions again, and I hope that the hour has been worthwhile for you. So I'm not sure how we say goodbye. We could all wave, I suppose, in a sort of.
And thank you for being such a kind and gracious host.
Oh no, not at all. You've been too lovely. But thank you, three of you, very, very much indeed for doing all the preparation, and yes, and cheers. So good health.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.